Hello, and welcome to a new episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. I'm your host, Margaret Edwards, and this week we are going to be talking about the House Rules Committee. And why do you ask that we're talking about the House Rules Committee? Well, first, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this part of the legislative process. If you remember from last time, we talked about the legislative process and each step and pretty much how a bill becomes a law. But this week, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the role and importance of the House Rules Committee within the legislative process in the House of Representatives. Also, Congress still on its August recess. The Senate was in for a few days of legislative business earlier this week, and the House actually does not return back from their August recess until September 20th. So we're still hanging out, not a whole lot of committee activity happening, but I mean, this is a good chance for us to take it, back to basics, talk about a bit more of process and procedure. That way, once, legislating is back in action, we're ready to go and we know what to do and the places that we can have an influence on the process. So the House Rules Committee. What is the role of the House Rules Committee? The main role is to pretty much determine and decide how legislation is going to move forward from it being passed out of the committee to making its way to the floor of the House of Representatives. They're this middle step in between committee passage and final passage on the floor. The House Rules Committee is commonly known as the Speaker's Committee because it is the mechanism that the Speaker uses to maintain control of the House floor. The House Rules Committee has a lot of power. It determines, what legislation eventually does make it to the floor and how it makes it to the floor under special rules. So there are two main areas of jurisdiction for the Rules Committee. The first are special orders, and we're going to dive into that a little bit later this episode. And the second is original jurisdiction. And this pretty much refers to changes that might be made to the standing rules of the House or measures that contain special rules within them. A fun fact about the Rules Committee is that it is the oldest standing committee. It was formed on April 2nd, 1789, and has been active and around in the House of Representatives ever since then. Also, as I said earlier, the House Rules Committee has a lot of power, kind of within their ability to, determine how the legislation moves to the floor of the House of Representatives. They also have the power to affect what the actual bill is. They can amend legislation right within the Rules Committee. So if one version is passed out of the Committee of Jurisdiction, and then it goes to the Rules Committee, they can make changes before it even gets to the floor, and it could be an entirely different bill. So again, Rules Committee, a lot of power, a lot of influence on what actually makes it to the floor of the House of Representatives. So the membership of the House Rules Committee, it is currently under the leadership of Chairman Jim McGovern, who is from Massachusetts, and the ranking member of the committee is Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma. The one thing to note about the membership of the House Rules Committee is that the ratio of majority to minority members is a 2-to-1 + 1. So in the current makeup, there are 9 members of the majority party, which at the present time is the Democratic Party, and then 4 members of the minority party in the House, which currently is the Republican Party. So there are 9 Democrats, 4 Republicans on the committee at its present time. There are 3 subcommittees in the House Rules Committee. The first is the Subcommittee on Expedited Procedures. There is the Subcommittee on Legislative and Budget Process, and then the Subcommittee on Rules and Organization of the House. And those subcommittees have, their subcommittee chair and subcommittee ranking member as well. And they work on, issues that fall under their jurisdiction. And then moving on, kind of, how the Rules Committee plays out. On here, the main thing that the Rules Committee does falls under special orders or special rules. And on here, we have the different types of rules that there are. But we'll get to these in just a sec. So let's start and look at actually the process of what happens to a piece of legislation whenever it arrives to the Rules Committee and eventually makes its way to the floor. So let's say we have this piece of legislation. It has been reported favorably out of committee, and the next stop is the Rules Committee. So the Committee of Jurisdiction, let's just say it's a bill that is coming out of Transportation and Infrastructure, the T&I Committee. Committee leadership will write to the Rules Committee saying, hey, we have this bill. We would like you guys to have a rules hearing on this piece of legislation. So that happens. The Rules Committee can decide yes or no whether to have the hearing. And then let's say they choose to hold the hearing. And they hold the hearing on the rule for the bill. And, this is an opportunity for members to come and speak in support of the bill, also to speak in opposition to the bill. The one kind of cool and special thing about Rules Committee hearings is that the members of Congress themselves are the witnesses. They're the ones speaking on behalf of the bill, speaking of its merits and why they should send it to the floor. But it also presents an opportunity to amend the bill before it even gets to the floor. And this is, certainly an opportunity, especially depending on what type of role the bill moves under. And then the third step in the Rules Committee process and the special rules process is that the rule itself is marked up in committee. This is done in consultation with majority party leadership and also with the Committee of Jurisdiction's leadership. And in the markup, it would determine the type of rule to be granted. And there are 4 different main types of rules, and we have them here on the screen. The first is an open rule. It, permits the offering of any amendment from the floor of the House of Representatives and would allow debate on that amendment under the 5-minute rule. So just 5 minutes tops to debate the amendment. The merits, the not merits, should an open rule be used. The next one are modified open rules. These are, much like an open rule, they have some restriction on the types of amendments that are allowed. As well as like an overall time limit. So if we decide to do a modified open rule, we might say we only have 2 hours to, make amendments, and then that's it. And then a structured rule. These specify the types of amendments, the amendments that have already been brought forward to the Rules Committee and decided that these are the amendments that we're going to allow to be considered. And so it's only a certain amount. You cannot make as unlimited amendments on the floor. And it also specifies the time for debate on the bill. Usually there will be, and structured rules, these are seen quite often in the House. So they might have a set of amendments here. Cool. We get this amount of, we're going to say within the rule that they're this long to debate these amendments, as well as the total debate for the bill. And then the final option that the Rules Committee has is a closed rule. And closed rules eliminate any chance of amending a bill on the floor of the House. And then, other than those reported by the committee reporting the bill, but that is already done in the Rules Committee hearing in the markup within the Rules Committee, and there's no opportunity for amendment on the floor. Closed rules are used often in bills that are very heavily favored by the majority party and then that the minority party might not be the biggest fans of. So the majority plays it out such that the minority party in the House cannot make amendments from the floor, cannot offer any amendments, and such that the bill that they want will be the bill that is ultimately voted on. And so the types of rules are considered in the markup. And once, the type of rule and all the different components of the rule are written out, which will include, the amendment process and laying that out, as well as how much time for debate will be allowed under the rule for consideration of the piece of legislation. And then, much like a, piece of legislation is reported out of committee, the special rule agreed to during the markup is reported out of the Rules Committee and filed on the floor of the House of Representatives. And then the rule itself is considered and debated on the floor of the House. It's typically 1 hour total debate. And out of courtesy for both the majority and the minority party will yield half of that 1 hour to the minority party to control. And then they will debate the rule itself at the close of the hour, and once all time is expired or has been yielded back. There is then a vote on the rule itself. If the rule passes, that means the bill that the rule is in relation to will then be taken up on the floor of the House of Representatives in the way that the rule determined how the bill will be considered on the House. It is kind of confusing, especially if you're thinking about the rule versus the actual piece of legislation. But, once, coming from me, a person who, has watched, rule consideration and bill and pieces of legislation consideration on the House of Representatives, you eventually get the feel for the difference between rules versus pieces of legislation. So I hope that, kind of just gives us a little bit more of a clue into what happens in the Rules Committee, how the Rules Committee works within the larger legislative process. So with that, that concludes this episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. Please be sure to tune in to our next episode, and you can find the Committee Corner in the NSPE Advocacy Center or on the NSPE YouTube page. Thank you.